step into the shadows of one of the most unsettling stories ever told in Crawford County, Arkansas. And before we unravel this tale, take a moment to drop in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is as you listen, because I want to know which corners of the world and which hours of the day or night this chilling piece of history is reaching. The year was 1893, and the Boston Mountains stretched their long, dark shadows across the valleys of northwestern Arkansas, where new railroads were beginning to slice through the isolation of scattered towns and farms. In this rugged land where old beliefs and whispered superstitions still shape daily life, two sisters would carve their place in local memory, remembered not for kindness or charity, but for something far more sinister. In an era when women were mostly seen only as daughters, wives, or widows, the Blackwood sisters lived by their own rules, defying what society expected. Strangers often found themselves welcomed by the sisters, with unusual warmth, their hospitality quickly becoming a legend along the rough roads between Van Buren and the nearby settlements. But behind those practiced smiles lurked darker intentions that would in time reveal one of the most disturbing cases in Arkansas history. That winter was harsh, even by local standards, and as February winds tore through the hills, the final threads of a mystery that had been quietly forming for almost 20 years were pulled loose. What came to light was pieced together later from court files, forgotten testimonies, and yellowed newspaper accounts, many of which stayed hidden until 1968, when a county clerk stumbled on a secret compartment in an old filing cabinet during courthouse renovations. From that moment, the people of Crawford County never looked at a friendly smile the same way again. Even today, the cry of a train whistle echoing through the valley seems to carry fragments of those grim memories. This is the story of the sisters whose welcomes hid wicked smiles. The place they lived became known as the Bitter Valley, not because of its soil, but because of the hardships it clung to everyone who tried to make a home there. About 12 miles northeast of Van Buren, Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood bought their homestead in 1871 from a widow named Sarah Hartley, who wanted to leave after her husband's sudden death. Locals gossiped not only because it was unusual for two unmarried women to buy land, but because they paid in cash, something rare in a community where most folks traded goods or relied on store credit. At first, the sisters kept to themselves. Jacob Miller, the owner of the nearest store, later recalled in 1887 that they only came in for necessities, were polite and always smiling, but those smiles never touched their eyes. Within a few years, the women had built a comfortable home, a tall, white two-story house with a wide porch where they rocked in chairs while watching travelers pass. Behind the house sat a barn, a smokehouse, and what neighbors called the long shed, a narrow structure whose use no one ever quite understood. The sisters were in their late 20s when they settled, though no records confirmed their births. Elizabeth the elder stood tall and thin with auburn hair pulled tight, while Margaret, shorter and fuller, wore her dark hair in the same severe style. Together they seemed ordinary, but time would prove there was nothing ordinary about them. Both women were said to look strikingly alike, with high cheekbones, thin lips, and pale gray eyes that many described as almost unnaturally bright. But their true peculiarity lay not in appearance, but in behavior. They lived with an intensity of privacy in their personal affairs, yet showed unusual warmth to strangers traveling the lonely roads through the valley. Around 1875, according to Reverend Thomas Galloway, in an 1894 Arkansas Gazette interview, they began quietly offering rooms to weary travelers. It was never a formal boarding house, more a resting stop. But word of their hospitality spread quickly. In rural Arkansas, kindness to strangers was expected, even a Christian duty. But the Blackwood sisters carried it beyond what most would ever think necessary. What the people of Crawford County could not have known was that the Blackwood name had already surfaced in newspapers, in places as far as Tennessee and Missouri, always connected to unexplained disappearances. Never enough for charges, just whispers and passing reports. With their new home along a well-traveled road, the stage was set. In March 1876, the first documented visitor to experience the strange welcome was William Fletcher, a 38-year-old cattle buyer from Fort Smith. A late winter storm forced him off the back roads in search of shelter. Fletcher later testified that he saw the Blackwood house just as the skies darkened. He admitted he felt something wrong about the place, even from the road. But staying outside meant risking the storm. As his horse neared the porch, both sisters appeared as though they had been waiting for him. Their movements mirrored each other, their smiles unbroken. "Good evening, sir. You've arrived just in time," Elizabeth said. "We've prepared a place for you," Margaret added, though Fletcher had sent no word of his coming. This strange sense of anticipation would become a hallmark of survivor accounts, some explaining it by the house's high vantage point over the road, others convinced there was something far darker at work. Inside, Fletcher was shown to a spotless parlor with a fire burning wing-back chairs arranged neatly and walls adorned with framed flowers. What unsettled him most was the stillness. No creaks of wood, no ticking clock, no rustle from the storm outside. The sisters pressed him to eat before resting. They served a stew that smelled inviting, but carried a bitter taste he could not place. After only a few bites, he excused himself, claiming fatigue. They led him upstairs to a perfectly kept bedroom. A bed, a washstand, and a single rocking chair placed not by the window, but facing the bed itself. Something about that detail chilled him. He later admitted he locked the door and braced it with a chair, convinced that sleep would be dangerous. His instincts proved right. Just past midnight, Fletcher awoke to the faint scrape of a hand testing the door handle. Then came whispers, two voices, low, deliberate, just outside in the hallway. Fletcher later recalled the unnerving sound of fingernails dragging slowly across the outside of his locked door, the scrape lasting several minutes before retreating down the hallway. At dawn, he found the sisters in the kitchen, both smiling as if nothing had happened, asking almost in unison whether he had slept well. Declining breakfast, he left at once, dropping $2 silver on the table. Margaret slipped them into her pocket without even glancing at them. As Fletcher rode away, he turned once to look back. The sisters still stood on the porch exactly as before, smiling, watching, unmoving like figures frozen for a photograph that was never taken. His unsettling experience might have been dismissed as a strange story, if not for the fact that it revealed the very patterns that would appear in testimony for years to come. The uncanny anticipation of travelers, the bitter-tasting meals, the nocturnal disturbances, and most distinctively, the eerie synchronization of the sisters' movements and smiles. Not every traveler was as fortunate. From 1876 to 1893, records suggest at least 27 people vanished after passing through what locals began to call Blackwood Valley. The disappearances came slowly. At first a salesman here, a farmhand there. People whose absence stirred little alarm because they had no close ties to the county. But by late 1877, the pattern had become harder to ignore. That summer, a railroad surveyor named Orville Jenkins sought shelter at the Blackwood house. Unlike Fletcher, he accepted dinner and noted in his journal that the food, though unusual, left him feeling unnaturally heavy, as if his thoughts were moving through molasses. His final entry, written in jagged scrawls, read, "Something wrong with this place. The sisters never sleep. I've watched them through the keyhole. They sit whispering all night in the kitchen. Can't make out words, head foggy, door locked, doesn't feel safe. They're smiling at me through the wood. I can feel it." When Jenkins failed to report back to his employers, a brief inquiry was made. Authorities questioned the Blackwood sisters nearly 2 weeks after he vanished. They expressed concern, confirmed he had stayed a single night, and claimed he left early the next morning heading north. Their account was calm, plausible, and without evidence to the contrary, their property went unsearched. Over the years, this same sequence repeated itself. A traveler disappeared. Suspicion drifted toward the sisters. They responded with polite concern, perfectly matching stories, and always those disarming smiles. With nothing concrete, officials had no grounds to act. As Sheriff James Hawkins later reflected, they were careful. They never touched locals, never anyone with deep roots here. They picked people who could vanish without raising much noise, and they always had explanations that could not be disproven. And that smile they had a way of making you want to believe them, even when your gut said otherwise. By 1883, wariness toward the Blackwoods had spread. Parents warned children not to take the road near their house. Travelers were urged at Miller's General Store to seek shelter elsewhere. Yet the sisters never showed bitterness at their growing isolation. On their rare trips into town, they remained as polite as ever, their smiles intact, their manner gracious, as if completely unaware of the whispered suspicions that trailed behind them. It was their consistency that unsettled people most recalled Abigail Parker, a longtime resident of Van Buren, in an interview with the Arkansas Gazette. Most folks, when they're upset or wronged, it shows in some way. The Blackwoods never changed. Same faces, same words, same posture year after year. It wasn't natural. Behind the white clapboard walls of their seemingly ordinary home, something sinister was unfolding, hidden beneath that calm exterior. Though the full truth wouldn't surface until much later, bank records discovered during the investigation provided one of the first tangible cracks in the sisters' facade. Between 1876 and 1893, Elizabeth and Margaret made regular deposits at the Arkansas National Bank in Van Buren. Individually, the sums were modest, but together they grew into a considerable amount. Even more telling, the timing of many deposits closely followed the disappearances that had begun to haunt the county. It was evidence of how meticulous the sisters were, not only in their manner, but also in their finances. By the mid-1880s, the Blackwood home had become a place many locals avoided, yet it still drew in the unwary. Strangers passing through remained vulnerable to the same hospitality that locals now feared. The valley's grim reputation deepened each missing traveler, adding weight to the name it had earned, the Bitter Valley. In the fall of 1884, a sudden cold front swept down from the Boston Mountains. Frost struck early, forcing farmers into frantic harvests, while merchants pushed to complete their routes before the roads became treacherous. Among them was Daniel Cooper, a 42-year-old peddler who had spent nearly a decade selling household goods throughout the region. He wasn't beloved, but he was well known, a familiar figure with his wagon and his old mare Bessie, bringing goods and gossip alike to scattered homes and settlements. What set Cooper apart from other travelers who crossed the Blackwoods path was his meticulous record-keeping. He carried a small leather-bound ledger in which he tracked his sales routes and notes about each trip. That habit would later prove critical. His final entry, dated October 17, 1884, noted sales in northern Crawford County before ending with a shaky line, weather turning, unlikely to reach Winfrey Township before nightfall. Recall mention of lodging available near Crossroads. Will inquire. It was the last trace of him. When Cooper failed to appear the following day for a scheduled meeting with a store owner in Winfrey Township, concern spread quickly. Within 3 days, his absence was no longer a rumor, but a cause for alarm. Unlike the migrant workers and nameless travelers who had disappeared before him, Cooper was part of a web of routines and appointments. His vanishing was noticed immediately, and for the first time, suspicion began to solidify into real fear. Sheriff James Hawkins wasted no time once Daniel Cooper's disappearance became undeniable. He assembled a search party to trace the peddler's route, and after 2 tense days, the group stumbled upon a discovery that would shift the investigation forever. Hidden in a thicket barely half a mile from the Blackwood property was Cooper's wagon. Its contents had been meticulously cleared out, every item of merchandise removed, yet his personal belongings were left behind. A small box containing unsold silver pocket watches remained untouched, along with the hidden money pouch beneath the driver's seat. His old mare Bessie was gone, but the scene made little sense as a robbery. As Hawkins later wrote, the valuable items were left untouched. It looked less like theft and more like someone wanted the man himself, not what he carried. The proximity to the Blackwood homestead was too close to ignore. For the first time, Hawkins had real evidence enough to justify a proper search. On October 22, 1884, he and 4 deputies rode up the familiar road to the house with the wide porch. Elizabeth and Margaret greeted them in their usual fashion, smiling serenely, answering questions without hesitation. Yes, they admitted a peddler had stopped by 5 days earlier to escape the weather. He had stayed the night, then supposedly departed at dawn toward Winfrey Township. When Hawkins informed them of the abandoned wagon, their response was measured, shocked concern, carefully delivered, their composure never faltering. The sisters even permitted a full search of their house and outbuildings, maintaining the air of gracious hosts. The deputies found nothing out of place. The home was immaculate, as though scrubbed to perfection. The barn contained only 1 horse theirs. The smokehouse held salted pork and venison from their own livestock. But when the party approached the structure, locals had long whispered about the long shed. Something shifted. For the first time in memory, Elizabeth's smile wavered just for a moment before she quickly steadied herself. Producing a key, she explained, "We keep personal items here, family heirlooms. Nothing of consequence to your inquiry." Inside the shed stretched 30 feet by 10, dimly lit through small windows. Rows of shelves lined the walls, each crowded with glass jars filled with cloudy liquid. At the center stood a heavy wooden table, its edges fitted with thick leather straps. For securing deer carcasses during butchering, Margaret volunteered her tone oddly rehearsed. Much tidier than working in the open. Hawkins stepped toward a shelf, lifted a jar into the pale light, and what he saw ended any doubt. Suspended in the murky fluid was a human ear. His report, filed that very day, was chillingly direct. Upon this discovery, I ordered the immediate arrest of Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood on suspicion of murder. The sisters went quietly, offering no resistance. And yet through the entire ordeal, while shackled, escorted, and confronted with what had been found, they never once dropped those unnerving smiles. The search of the long shed turned into a nightmare none of the deputies ever forgot. Lined neatly along the shelves were 87 glass jars, each holding preserved human remains. Most contained small parts, fingers, ears, even what several men identified as pieces of tongue. Not a single complete body was found anywhere on the property, though investigators dug up several patches of disturbed soil around the farm. The sisters offered no explanation. When pressed about the jars, they refused to answer directly, only asking with their fixed smiles that they be allowed to remain in the same cell together. The discovery exploded into headlines across Arkansas. From Crawford County to Little Rock, newspapers described the women as monsters in feminine form and branded the shed a chamber of horrors unlike any in state history. Still, the case faced challenges. For all the shock, the evidence was largely circumstantial. Without full bodies, without witnesses, proving outright murder would be difficult. The sisters had been meticulous, erasing most traces of their crimes, selecting victims who would not be missed, and keeping their stories so consistent that for years they had eluded suspicion. The real breakthrough came not from the Cooper case, but from an unexpected survivor. Thomas Reed, a 54-year-old livestock trader, recognized the sisters' names in the papers and came forward. He revealed that he had stayed at the Blackwood house in the spring of 1882. Like William Fletcher before him, Reed had trusted his instincts and avoided eating the meal they prepared. "I had a rule on the road," he told investigators. "Never eat unless you see your host eat it too. The Blackwood women served me, but didn't touch a bite themselves. Said they had already eaten. That was enough for me to push food around my plate and leave it be." That night, Reed experienced the same haunting disturbances Fletcher had described. The rattling of his door handle hushed whispers in the hallway and the faint sound of scratching against the wood. Unlike Fletcher, however, Reed left with a firm suspicion about the fate of those who did eat. "I told Sheriff Collins in Sebastian County what I thought, but with no proof there was nothing to be done. I warned folks I knew, but I never imagined the scale of it." Reed's testimony, paired with the gruesome evidence from the shed, gave investigators the grounds to widen their search. About a mile from the Blackwood property, they turned to a cave system locals called Devil's Den. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Inside lay the remains of at least 21 people, bones scattered and in varying states of decay. Many showed signs of deliberate butchering. They processed them like livestock, said Dr. William Harrington, who examined the remains. Clean cuts, systematic separation of parts. This wasn't rage or impulse. It was calculated. Back at the Blackwood house, deputies made another chilling find. Hidden beneath the kitchen floorboards was a stash of personal belongings, pocket watches, rings, wallets, and other effects. They were ordinary items, yet each one represented a life cut short, a victim whose journey had ended at the sisters' doorstep beneath those unwavering smiles. Each relic pulled from beneath the kitchen floor told its own silent story. Wrapped in cloth and carefully labeled with nothing more than dates, the items spanned from 1871 to 1884. The earliest date preceded the sisters' move to Crawford County, suggesting their grim work had begun elsewhere and lending weight to whispers about unsolved disappearances in Tennessee and Missouri. But the most chilling discovery came not from the shed or the floorboards, but from Elizabeth Blackwood's own bed frame. Hidden in a secret compartment was a leather-bound journal written in her elegant, deliberate script. At first glance, it resembled a recipe book, but closer reading revealed entries that were anything but culinary. One dated May 1879 read, Subject 12. Male, approximately 30 years, robust constitution. Preparation. A yielded stronger effect than in previous subjects. Unconsciousness achieved in 17 minutes rather than usual 25 to 30. Margaret believes addition of white snake root responsible. Will continue with this modification. The journal left little doubt about the sisters' methods. They had been conducting experiments on their guests, testing the potency of natural sedatives and toxins drawn from the plants of the Boston Mountains. Elizabeth's notes were clinical, almost detached, focused only on the timing of effects, never on purpose. The lack of motive, no hint of why they did what they did, would spark speculation for generations. Were the sisters scientists in the cruelest sense seekers of knowledge, no matter the cost? Or were they something else entirely driven by hungers no one dared name? By the close of 1884, Elizabeth and Margaret sat in the Crawford County Jail in Van Buren, awaiting trial not just for the disappearance of Daniel Cooper, but potentially for dozens of others. Yet their composure never wavered. They smiled at guards. They spoke with the same calm, synchronized voices that had unsettled neighbors for more than a decade. "It is as though they do not grasp the seriousness of their situation," wrote Reverend Galloway after visiting them. "Or perhaps they grasp something the rest of us do not. Either possibility chills me." Then, on a frigid January morning in 1885, the case twisted into legend. At 4:30 a.m., the night guard discovered the sisters' cell was empty. The lock was intact, the barred window undisturbed. None of the other prisoners reported hearing a sound. The Blackwoods had simply ceased to be there. Sheriff Hawkins raised search parties at once. Neighboring counties were alerted descriptions sent across Arkansas and into bordering states. For weeks, men scoured the roads and forests. Not a single credible sighting emerged. It was as though they turned to smoke. One deputy remarked, "No horses missing, no footprints in the mud, no whispers of strangers passing through." They were there, and then they were gone. Speculation spread quickly. Some insisted the sisters must have had accomplices who smuggled them out, though none had ever been identified during the investigation. Others, leaning toward superstition, whispered that the Blackwoods had never been bound by ordinary laws of nature, that their smiles and their unearthly composure were masks for something darker, powers no decent Christian would dare speak aloud. Whatever the truth, the Blackwood sisters vanished as mysteriously as their victims, leaving behind only jars, bones, and the kind of fear that lingers long after the doors are locked and the lights are out. The most accepted explanation for the sisters' disappearance, though never proven, was that they had somehow acquired a duplicate key to their cell, perhaps through bribery or by compromising someone on the jail staff. Sheriff Hawkins investigated that possibility exhaustively. But if corruption existed, no one confessed and no trail ever surfaced. With Elizabeth and Margaret gone, the case against them collapsed. The jars, the journal, the testimonies, all of it remained. But without the accused present, a trial could not proceed. Officially, the file stayed open, but as months passed without new leads, it grew colder. Public fascination also faded. By the summer of 1885, newspaper coverage of the so-called Smiling Sisters had dwindled to passing mentions. By the following year, their names had all but vanished from print, replaced by fresher scandals and tragedies. In Crawford County, life crept back toward normal. The Blackwood property seized after the arrest stood abandoned. Superstitions ran so deep that no one dared buy or settle it. Over time, the county dismantled the buildings, salvaging materials for other uses. Within a decade, nature had reclaimed the clearing. The house was gone, the barn rotted, the smokehouse collapsed. Only the stone foundation remained slowly sinking into the soil, as if the earth itself wanted to bury the memory. The case might have remained a dark but fading ghost story, if not for an unexpected twist nearly 8 years later. In February 1893, a well-dressed man in his early 30s arrived in Van Buren, introducing himself as Thomas Blackwood, nephew of Elizabeth and Margaret. He claimed he had only recently uncovered his aunt's scandalous past while researching family genealogy. "I come not to defend their actions, which appear indefensible," he told Sheriff William Davis, who had succeeded the now retired Hawkins, "but to understand them, and perhaps to make amends to the community they harmed." His timing immediately raised suspicion. The date of his arrival was almost exactly 8 years to the day since the sisters' escape. Sheriff Davis briefly detained him for questioning, but his papers appeared genuine. His story of being raised in Mississippi by distant relatives after the death of his parents seemed consistent with what little was known about the family's scattered history. Thomas Blackwood rented a room at the Van Buren Hotel and began immersing himself in the case. He requested access to the old evidence, interviewed locals who still remembered the ordeal, and made repeated visits to the overgrown site of the Blackwood farm. He seemed genuinely unsettled about his connection to those women, recalled Martin Wilson, a courthouse clerk. Spent hours reading through records, taking careful notes. Asked thoughtful questions. Never once tried to excuse them. He said more than once he wanted to understand so he could make sure nothing like it ever happened again in his family. For 2 weeks, Thomas Blackwood pursued his research quietly and without incident, a man haunted by bloodlines and shadows determined to unearth the truth about the women whose legacy had nearly been buried with the ruins of their house. Thomas Blackwood quickly earned a reputation in Van Buren as a man of composure and courtesy. He was polite without being ingratiating, articulate without being showy, and always somber when discussing his family's dark legacy. Some locals even admitted to pitying him, burdened as he seemed to be with bloodlines that carried so much horror. But sympathy turned to dread on February 27, 1893, when a young hotel housekeeper named Eleanor Richards failed to return home after her shift. Her family raised the alarm the next morning, and a search of her small room at the Van Buren Hotel revealed nothing unusual except for a note on hotel stationery. It read, "Mr. Blackwood requests assistance with organizing his research materials this evening. Will likely return late." Sheriff William Davis moved swiftly to question Thomas Blackwood, only to learn he had already vanished. He had checked out of the hotel just after midnight, leaving behind no possessions, no papers, no trace of his meticulous research. The timing coinciding perfectly with Richard's disappearance was too sharp to dismiss as coincidence. Davis ordered an immediate search, concentrating on the abandoned Blackwood homestead and the Devil's Den cave system. It was near that cave, in a newly built hunting cabin, 3 miles off the main road that deputies discovered Richards. She was alive, though dazed, seated in a rocking chair facing the window. On the table beside her was a teacup containing traces of a plant-based sedative, one eerily similar to the mixtures described years earlier in Elizabeth Blackwood's journal. When first found, Richards repeated a chilling phrase. "She keeps smiling at me. She says I'm almost ready." Once her strength returned, Richards provided a harrowing account. She confirmed that Blackwood had asked for her help with his papers, offering her tea upon her arrival. The drink quickly left her lightheaded and confused. Her last clear memory in the hotel room was of Blackwood by the window. "He smiled at me," she said. "Not a normal smile. Too wide, too wrong. And then he said, 'Aunt Elizabeth will be so pleased to meet you.' After that, her memories came in fragments being carried into a wagon, then into the remote cabin. Richards described drifting in and out of consciousness for what felt like days, though less than 48 hours had passed. During her waking moments, she was attended not only by Blackwood, but by a woman she never fully saw. The figure lingered in shadow, her voice soft and melodic, her movements smooth and unnatural. She told me I was being prepared. Richards recalled that I would help them finish what they started years ago. She said the work must continue. The collection must grow. Most disturbing of all, Richards remembered overhearing a conversation between Blackwood and this shadowed woman. They spoke of leaving Arkansas and moving to new territory, mentioning a place that sounded to her like Meridian. Sheriff Davis immediately wired authorities in Meridian, Mississippi, with warnings that Thomas Blackwood and possibly Elizabeth and Margaret themselves might be headed their way. Yet ambiguity remained, for there were several towns named Meridian across the South, and Richard's weakened state left her uncertain. Even so, her survival marked a first in the bloody history of the Blackwoods. She was the only abductee known to escape alive and coherent, her testimony confirming that the sisters, or something tied to them, were still at work nearly a decade after their supposed disappearance. Eleanor Richards's survival was widely believed to be the result of her captors leaving in haste, likely spurred by the growing scrutiny around the man calling himself Thomas Blackwood. When investigators dug deeper, They found no record of any Thomas Blackwood fitting his description in Mississippi or anywhere else. The documents he had shown Sheriff Davis, birth records, family papers, travel credentials, were forgeries executed with disturbing skill. His sharp features, high cheekbones, thin lips, and those unnaturally bright gray eyes all hinted at something far closer than nephew. In his final report, Sheriff Davis put into writing what many already suspected: the man was most likely the son of Elizabeth or Margaret Blackwood, born before they ever arrived in Crawford County and raised elsewhere until adulthood. If true, his purpose in Van Buren became chillingly clear. He had come to gather details of the investigation, ensuring the sisters could remain hidden while also reviving the abductions they had carried out more than a decade before. The Richards incident reignited a storm of headlines. Papers from Arkansas to Missouri ran front-page stories about the smiling sisters and their mysterious heir. Sightings poured in from across the South train stations, remote towns, even cities as far as St. Louis, but none proved credible. Richards herself never fully recovered. Though she bore no physical injuries, she suffered recurring nightmares and carried a lifelong aversion to tea. Within a year, she left Van Buren for her sister's home in Texas, rarely speaking of what she had endured. The cabin where she had been held was searched thoroughly. Aside from Richard's account and faint traces of sedatives in the abandoned teacup, the most significant find was a hidden stash of empty glass jars beneath the floorboards. They were identical to those discovered years earlier in the Blackwood shed, a sign that the sisters' methods, or their sons, had been carried forward. By late spring of 1893, however, the trail had gone cold. No further sightings of the sisters, or the man calling himself Thomas, were verified. Updated descriptions were circulated to sheriffs in multiple states. But summer passed into autumn with no new leads. The case slipped once more into silence. In Crawford County, the story faded back into whispered warnings. Travelers were cautioned against accepting hospitality too readily, against trusting two smiles that seemed too fixed, too perfect. Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood were never seen again. No bodies, no graves, no proof of their ultimate fate was ever found. Whether they vanished into Meridian, Mississippi, or some other hidden place, their end remains speculation. What is certain is that between 1871 and 1884, at least 21 people disappeared near the Blackwood property. The evidence recovered bones jars, and Elizabeth's clinical journal proved these were no accidents. The sisters acted with precision, their motives never fully explained. Some historians believe they pursued a twisted form of scientific research, drawing from legitimate medical writings and applying them in ways that crossed into horror. Others argue their work was more occult than scientific, pointing to passages in the journal that referenced preservation of essence and distillation of vital elements. Whether born of cold science, hidden ritual, or something stranger still, the Blackwood case stands as one of the most disturbing and unsolved chapters in Arkansas history. The sisters who smiled at strangers left behind only questions about their purpose, their legacy, and how much of their story will forever remain buried in the shadows of the Boston Mountains. Analysts who have studied the Blackwood case agree on one crucial point: the sisters operated with a chilling degree of foresight and calculation that was rare for the time and place. Their methods were not static, but evolved, becoming more efficient and harder to detect with each passing year. They carefully chose their victims, targeting those whose disappearances would stir little notice while avoiding anyone too well connected to the local community. In doing so, they demonstrated a sophisticated awareness of risk and consequence that put them far ahead of the era's law enforcement capabilities. The case stands today as one of the earliest documented examples of serial killers working in tandem, each with distinct roles. Elizabeth, as revealed through her journal, seemed to be the planner and experimenter, the architect of their methods. Margaret appeared to act as her aide, perhaps responsible for maintaining order and disposing of evidence. The arrival of a third figure, the man who called himself Thomas Blackwood, expanded the narrative in ways investigators at the time could not fully grasp. If he was indeed the son of one of the sisters, as his uncanny resemblance suggested, their crimes may not only have been systematic, but generational, a grim inheritance carried forward. Sheriff William Davis, who pursued the case until his death in 1906, expressed this unease in his personal writings. "I am haunted not by what we know of the Blackwood women, but by what we do not know. Where were they before Crawford County? What shaped them into what they became? And most troubling of all, are they truly gone, or only continuing their work beyond our reach?" For years after the disappearance of the sisters and the Richards incident, no further crimes in Arkansas could be tied to them. The story slipped into folklore, retold with exaggerations until fact and legend blurred. But in 1927, the Blackwood name, or at least their legacy, resurfaced. During the demolition of an old house on the edge of Meridian, Mississippi, workers uncovered a concealed cellar. Inside were glass jars containing preserved human remains, ledgers filled with dates and cryptic notes, and botanical samples of plants with known sedative and toxic qualities. The parallels to the Crawford County evidence were undeniable. Property records showed the house had been purchased in 1894 by two women using the names Elizabeth and Margaret Wilson. They operated it as a boarding house for 3 years before vanishing without explanation, leaving the home to decay. Elderly neighbors who still remembered them described their appearance in ways consistent with the Blackwoods, though the passage of time prevented certainty. More troubling, several recalled a young man often seen visiting the women referred to as their nephew. One neighbor later told reporters, "He smiled in a way that wasn't right, too practiced, like something he had learned rather than felt." The Meridian discovery strongly suggested that the Blackwoods had resumed their activities under assumed identities, albeit for a shorter span of time. Unlike their 13 years in Arkansas, they remained in Mississippi for only 3, hinting at a more cautious, transient lifestyle, perhaps deliberately moving before suspicion could take hold. After 1897, however, their trail went cold once more. If they continued elsewhere, they did so with greater discretion, leaving behind no clear trail of victims or evidence. In 1941, journalist Robert Thornton sought to piece together a definitive history of the case. His research took him from Arkansas to Mississippi, and eventually across several southern states, chasing fragmentary leads and rumors. Though Thornton never produced a completed account, his notes preserved the sense that the Blackwood sisters' story had never truly ended, that somewhere their shadow still lingered. Robert Thornton's notes, preserved today in the Arkansas Historical Society archives, paint a picture both fragmented and haunting. He spoke with dozens of individuals who between 1893 and 1920 claimed to have encountered women resembling Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood. Many stories lacked firm evidence, but the consistencies were striking. Women who smiled without pause, moved in uncanny synchrony, and showed unusual interest in medicinal plants and the workings of the human body. In October 1942, Thornton traveled to eastern Texas to meet a woman who claimed she had worked as a housekeeper for 2 elderly sisters back in 1915. Her description of the sisters echoed the Blackwoods, their collection of plant specimens, their habit of speaking almost in unison, their unsettling composure. Thornton never returned from that trip. 2 weeks later, his car was discovered abandoned near the Texas-Arkansas border. Neither he nor the woman he sought to interview was ever seen again. His disappearance, officially unsolved, cast a pall over further inquiries. From that point on, The Blackwood case became a subject for private fascination rather than public pursuit, traded in letters and whispered speculation rather than formal reports. A generation later, in 1968, renovations at the Van Buren Courthouse uncovered a hidden compartment inside an old filing cabinet. Among the forgotten files was a sealed envelope labeled for future investigators of the Blackwood matter. Inside was a letter dated January 20th, 1885, 5 days after the sisters' escape from jail, purportedly written by Elizabeth Blackwood herself. In it, she addressed those who might one day revisit her crimes. You who seek to understand what we have done have asked the wrong questions. You search for method when you should seek purpose. You catalog actions when you should examine necessity. What appears to you as aberration is in fact dedication to work begun long before any living memory. The collection grows. The knowledge expands. The legacy continues through bloodlines you cannot trace and by methods you cannot fathom. We are not monsters. We are students of the most complex system ever created, the human form in all its variations. We do not expect forgiveness or understanding. We require only the freedom to continue our studies. By the time you read these words, that work will have advanced beyond your capacity to hinder it. We smile because we know what you do not. Handwriting analysis confirmed the letter, matched Elizabeth's journal entries, though forgery could not be fully ruled out. Its tone and timing, however, aligned disturbingly well with the sisters' escape and disappearance. The find briefly reignited interest in the Blackwood mystery, but with witnesses long dead and physical evidence degraded or lost, little could be added to the record. The last potential thread emerged in 1954, though it wasn't recognized as part of the case until after the 1968 letter came to light. That November, authorities in a small Louisiana parish investigated the quiet death of an elderly recluse, known only as Miss Margaret. For 20 years she had lived alone in a remote cabin, seen rarely, except when locals sought her knowledge of plants and remedies. When officials searched her cabin, they uncovered a cache of notebooks, pages of meticulous notes, cataloging the effects of various botanical compounds on the human body. Though she had apparently died of natural causes, the discovery of her writings raised unsettling questions. The detail, the tone, the focus on precision, all echoed the Blackwoods' methods. Some whispered that Miss Margaret was none other than Margaret Blackwood herself, having slipped through the decades under a new identity, continuing the work she and her sister once pursued together in Arkansas. No proof ever surfaced. But with the letter, the journals, and the whispers of those who claimed to have seen them, the legacy of the Smiling Sisters endured, half history, half nightmare, lingering in the shadows of Southern folklore. More chilling than the notebooks themselves were the references to subjects listed only by numbers, along with sparse physical details and clinical notes on the effects of various botanical compounds. Though local authorities in Louisiana briefly investigated Miss Margaret's writings as potential evidence of homicide, no bodies or physical remains were uncovered near the cabin. With no definitive crime and the elderly woman deceased, the matter was quietly closed. It wasn't until 1970, when a retired Arkansas State Police officer reviewed unsolved cases, that the possible connection between Miss Margaret and Margaret Blackwood was recognized. By that time, however, much of the potential evidence was gone. The cabin itself had burned down in 1962, and any surviving notebooks or artifacts had long since vanished. What unsettled researchers most was the fact that Miss Margaret's cabin stood only about 30 miles from the site where Robert Thornton's abandoned car had been discovered in 1942, raising disturbing questions about whether her presence in the area and Thornton's disappearance were linked. But without proof, it remains an eerie speculation. The broader implications of the Blackwood case have troubled historians and criminologists for generations. Elizabeth's 1885 letter spoke of purpose rather than method, legacy rather than guilt, suggesting that what began in Crawford County was only one chapter in an effort meant to continue across places and even across bloodlines. If her words are to be believed, their work was passed down through family ties. You cannot trace, ensuring that even if Elizabeth and Margaret themselves were lost to history, their influence might live on. The physical traces of the original case have nearly all been erased. The Blackwood house site has long since been reclaimed by forest, with no marker to warn or inform passers-by. The caves where human remains were once found have been sealed, and their precise locations hidden in public records. The jars table and other evidence from the long shed were destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1931, leaving only faded photographs and written descriptions. Today, the only surviving artifacts are Elizabeth's journal kept under restricted access in the Arkansas State Archives, and the 1968 letter, which raises more questions than it answers. For criminologists, the Blackwoods represent a troubling anomaly, female serial killers who acted as a team with methods as deliberate and systematic as any documented in modern times. Their focus on experimentation physiology and the preservation of remains sets them apart from typical motives associated with serial crime. For residents of Crawford County and the other communities touched by their story, the legacy is darker still. A reminder that evil can smile, can offer shelter, can appear as kindness before revealing its true face. The most unsettling possibility is that the Blackwoods' work did not end with the sisters themselves. If Thomas was indeed their son, then the legacy may have carried forward past to descendants who learned the methods as a grim inheritance. Sheriff Davis, shortly before his death in 1906, voiced the fear most dared not say aloud. "I am haunted not by what we know of the Blackwood women, but by what we do not." Perhaps they are gone. Perhaps not. Perhaps their blood still walks among us, smiling, waiting. Some nights, when sleep won't come, I think about the Blackwood sisters and wonder if somewhere in some forgotten corner, they're still smiling, and who they might be smiling at. The Bitter Valley earned its name in ways its first settlers could never have imagined. The echoes of what happened there in the 1870s and 1880s still resonate, a dark harmony running beneath the surface of local history, a reminder that some stories don't end. They slip into shadows, continue behind closed doors, behind unwavering smiles. On nights when the wind moves through the Boston mountains, just so locals claim, you can hear whispers near the old Blackwood property, soft voices speaking in perfect unison, murmuring preparations, making plans, welcoming unseen guests. And if you listen long enough, they say you might catch the sound that haunted Eleanor Richards for the rest of her life. The slow, steady rhythm of rocking chairs on a wooden porch, figures sitting in shadow, their faces hidden, but their smiles somehow visible, even in the dark. The story of the sisters who welcomed with wicked smiles has no ending, no final moment of justice, no closure. It simply changes form, passing from one generation to the next, like the legacy Elizabeth described in her letter, a persistent shadow on the landscape of American crime history, a cautionary tale without a neat moral, a mystery without a solution. What is known with certainty is grim enough. Between 1871 and 1884, at least 21 people disappeared after encountering Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood. Beyond the partial remains found in the cave, what became of those victims is unknown. What became of the sisters themselves remains equally uncertain. The purpose behind their actions still defies explanation. What endures is the warning their story carries. Be wary of those who smile too readily, too perfectly. Be cautious of hospitality offered too eagerly by people who live in isolation. Remember that behind every smile there may be secrets darker than you can imagine. In Crawford County, that warning is still heeded. Strangers are met with quiet caution. Offers of help come with watchful eyes. And smiles, especially fixed, unwavering smiles, are regarded not with trust, but with a subtle edge of suspicion. The Bitter Valley remembers even if the history books don't. The sisters who welcomed with wicked smiles may be gone, but the shadow they cast remains a chill that lingers long after the story ends. Listen closely on your way home tonight. Watch for unusual movements in the dark. And if you meet women whose smiles never falter, whose movements mirror each other with unnatural precision, whose hospitality feels just a little too perfect, remember the Blackwood sisters. Choose another path. Because some welcomes lead not to safety, but to oblivion. And some smiles conceal intentions too terrible to contemplate. They are watching. They are waiting. They are smiling.